Today's ship chat is a request by Navark Tully DT. If you want to support the channel and have suggestions for a ship chat, then consider joining at the Commander tier. Or if you want access to the exclusive artwork that I create for these videos, then you can join at the Centurion tier. Thank you very much. Right. Today we're going to be looking at Tully DT's request, the Andorian Kumari. This was a nice combo of requests to get, to have the previous ship chat to look at the Dakia and now to look at its main adversary, the Kumari. There's a nice, we've got a little mini-series going on here, because I'll probably then look at the fleets overall of Andoria and Vulcan and do a little comparison. It's an interesting period in Star Trek history, which, was covered, but no one's really dug into in any depth. So let's go into it. So first, let's look at the behind the scenes of this very interesting ship. A lot of people have said that it looks very Battlestar Galactica. It first appeared in the Enterprise episode Ceasefire, which is a very formative episode, and it was designed by John Eves. He had basically nothing to go off in the design process and did a bunch of designs, including like a manta ray. But ultimately, the Kumari design is very inspired by Battlestar Galactica, very obviously, and also from World War II American fighter bombers, which have the gull wings, or indeed Stukas. But having that gull wing look, that's a very World War II style look. The model was then built by Pierre Droulet, and then a light kit was done by Rob Bonchoon. Now, in terms of its sort of fan reception, the Kumari is something that strikes me as a bit of Marmite. People either love it or they hate it. Most people don't hate it who dislike it, but they don't feel that it is a Star Trek ship. And it is certainly unusual for a Star Trek ship. It's not recognizable. But actually, the devil's in the details. And in the details, it certainly is a Star Trek ship, but just not as we know it. Because this is from, a much earlier period where technology was a lot more divergent. So I guess we'll get into it in universe. So it's 360 meters long. That's long for the 22nd century. That's a pretty big ship. But you look at it from the top down, you compare it to Enterprise, it is quite skinny. So on one level, yes, it is quite big, but actually it's not as big as it might initially look. And certainly when you see it in the show properly scaled, it doesn't seem too bad. Now, I think part of the reason that it's big is because it's got to fight Vulcan ships, which are massive. So there's almost, you're kind of already seeing that idea of scale creep as two powers are trying to outcompete one another. Another thing to go off the size is that the crew complement is apparently 87. I do not believe that for a second. Not for a ship of that size. Really, Enterprise's crew should not be 82 people. It should be like double that at least. But it is a very unique design. You obviously have the main habitable mass in the prow, in that sort of head section. You then actually have, it's very difficult to see, but it does actually have a double neck design. There's a small gap between the two necks. Quite why they left that gap open, who knows? Perhaps the upper and lower modules can actually change. You see how the prow itself is split in two. And I wonder if you can get upper and lower modules that can mesh together, possibly, and that's why they have that double neck system. You also have, interestingly, this has been a subject of much discussion and debate, but it does in fact look like there are two types of warp nacelle at play. The reason I say that they are warp nacelles is because, well, clearly the outboard engine units, those are nacelles. The main unit in the rear that sort of goes vertical, there's vertically orientated, that's blue. So it has to be a warp nacelle. That is certainly what the design language is indicating, that it's a warp nacelle because it's the same thing as the engine pods. So you have these armoured pods and then a vertical pair. So what we actually have here is perhaps the first instance of dual mode nacelles. Dual mode nacelles were very popular in the 23rd century. The idea of having two sets of nacelles to do two different jobs. The vertical nacelles are probably for normal cruising, and therefore, they're low profile. You have a pretty tight warp field, tight warp geometry, very efficient. You probably would not have much maneuverability from those engines. The outboard boosters, they look like an additional add-on. They look like that was something that was added to the class later. So I think it was there to enable high-speed cruising. What I can imagine these existed for was for outrunning or outmaneuvering outrunning or outmaneuvering Vulcan Charan class cruisers, which are very, very fast. And, the Charan is very fast, but it can't turn. So if you've got a ship that's even slightly maneuverable and it can put on some good speed, you should be safe. Now, the outboard nacelles may also have a function of aiding the impulse units. You have a pair of red impulse units either side of the main sort of fin engines, as we'll call them. And I suspect that actually the pod nacelles serve as a sort of a booster. By activating them, you will lower your ship's inertial mass, thus allowing you greater acceleration. Again, very important when you're fighting big, powerful, but slow Vulcan ships. The Kumari is quite fast, and it's well armoured as well. You can certainly see from the dorsal plating, it's pretty well protected, although less so on the side. And critically, its main asset to survival is its speed, so it doesn't spend too long too close to Vulcan ships. Its armour gives you that margin for error. But then 3, you fight in a way in which you minimise the Vulcan's advantages, i.e. at long range, because Vulcan plasma cannons are deadly up close, but they are much, much weaker at range. And that is where Andorian particle cannons come in. Now you have 4 long-range particle cannons in the pods. You can see them rigged to the outboard wings. They're effectively 4, although they fire both forwards and backwards. And because they are paired together like that, they can also chain together to fire a more powerful shot. If you chain them both together to fire, you will have some time between your next shots. So, depending on whether or not that's advantageous at that time. Now, it also has, from what we can observe, 4 light cannons. Dorsal, ventral, on the dorsal and ventral, basically prow and aft. And these are probably just close-in defences. We see them using them from time to time, but they're certainly not favoured. Now, there's no suggestion that the Kumari is armed with torpedoes. In fact, looking at the model, I can't even see a potential torpedo launcher. Now, you might say that that kind of doesn't work for a Star Trek ship, but this is the 22nd century. Torpedoes are not really necessary. They're quite a specialist weapon in this period and not necessarily the most effective. The Andorians are fighting the Vulcans. The Vulcans' main advantage is in shield technology, and shields work best against projectile weapons. So to use a projectile weapon like a torpedo against a Vulcan ship would be a waste of time. You'd be far better off using long-range particle weapons, which can drain their shields over time, and that would also then enable you to still do damage to their hull, because Vulcan ships don't appear to be the most well-armoured things. There's plenty of windows, and generally the hull looks quite soft. And actually, given the environment of Vulcan, I wonder if they would even have the resources available to make strong armour, as compared to Andoria, which is near a gas giant, and probably has a lot of useful minerals. So in terms of its tactics, basically what it's going to do, it's going to snipe at long range and avoid Vulcan plasma cannons. Then as the Vulcan shields weaken, it's going to close in to try and score those critical hits on particular targets, be more accurate. At that point, it's going to rely a lot more on its armor than shields. Yes, Andorian ships have shields, but it's probably not the most reliable defense against Vulcans, particularly at close range. You're going to really be relying on your armor to protect against those plasma weapons. It also has the ability to use boarding craft. Again, this is something that perhaps the Vulcans won't be expecting. It's a good way, you can seize a Vulcan ship, which is, that looks great. Those are the two circular doors or circular hatches on either side of the main hull. Those, I believe, are for launching boarding pods or escape pods or whatever, but I think boarding pods would make a lot of sense. And you can attack and latch onto the Vulcan ship and take control. You kind of say Andorian commandos versus Vulcans. Can they really match the aggression of Andorian shock troopers? Remains to be seen. It also then has two shuttle bays for various forms of attack craft or shuttles. They're quite big. They're mounted both on the dorsal and ventral and can probably each take a pod. So that's pretty much the summary of the capabilities of the Kumari. As you can see, it's a very specialist ship in many respects, but it's a very strong battlecruiser for the 22nd century, and I would say battlecruiser is a fair terminology for it. It's designed to fight a battleship, Vulcan battleships. Again, let's not mince words, that's what those things are. But it's faster and it is more maneuverable. So, I mean, if in terms of just kind of comparing it to various Vulcan ships, it is probably going to have the advantage against the Surak, probably would have a disadvantage against a Charan. And again, you'd need at least two to be taking on a Dakir, if not more. Another interesting note is that you compare it to Klingon ships, and it kind of outshines most. The only thing that I think could really threaten it or challenge it would be a D4 or a D5, if the D5 was able to get close. And then the D5 would certainly be able to put on a lot of damage, but the main challenger is going to be the D4, which has that long-range torpedo capability. That's going to be the real threat to the Kumari. In conclusion, if it wasn't for the Vulcans, I'm quite sure that this ship would have dominated the 22nd century. You see the capabilities of Andorian technology, and this is certainly a formidable ship and, able to go into places where, Vulcans fear to tread and survive. It also demonstrates Andorian ambition and innovation. There's a lot of interesting technologies and ideas going on with this ship. They don't really build it in an orthodox way. There seems to be a lot of room for growth as well. They build these ships with the idea that they are going to be upgrading them throughout their careers, which again is a very forward-looking aspect, and actually perhaps is partially where that comes from in Federation designs, later Federation designs, as well as the human tendency for doing that, but also I think it comes from the Andorians as well. I think that's something where both Andorian and human technology overlaps. So, I mean, really, just by finishing remarks, I think it's also worth saying that, looking at this and looking at the Dakir, you can certainly say that the Vulcan-Andorian war would have been a hell of a sight, would have been a hell of a thing to watch. And it would have probably put the Romulan Earth War to shame. So I suppose it's just lucky that it didn't happen.